I read somewhere that a cottage garden is the personal statement of someone who's at peace with life.
Alex Pankhurst is an expert in the history of cottage garden plants and has written a book on people with plants named after them, Who Does Your Garden Grow? I asked her what she felt made a garden a cottage garden.
It's more a lack of discipline in one way. You have not to mind things that seed themselves. You have to have a little bit of a jumble, I think, but a slightly organised jumble, because if you let things seed themselves everywhere, you will end up with just one thing, and that'll be the strongest thing.
In a windy garden like this, many plants do seed themselves far and wide. Most, of course, are specially planted, and I noticed a fine clump of different coloured ranunculus.
I bought it just for fun. It was all the rage in the 1700s, and in fact, at the end of the 18th century, there were 800 varieties available. And it went out of fashion about the middle of the last century, and now it's coming back again. I bought it, planted a couple of plants thinking they wouldn't come through the winter, but they have. They're terrific, so I planted a few more.
But one plant that's been in fashion for ages, and I'm sure always will be, is this one. It's a splendid plant.
Oh yes, bleeding heart, or Dicentra spectabilis. It was introduced in the last century and immediately became a cottage garden favourite, possibly because it doesn't like having its root disturbed, and in cottage gardens it wasn't. No. And they had all sorts of names for it. They called it Lady in the Bath, and Bleeding Heart, and the Lyre Plant, and Dutchman's Breeches. In Denmark, it was known as Heart of a Lieutenant, on the grounds that when you pulled aside the sides of the heart, there is a dancer and a champagne bottle, and that, of course, is what is in the heart of a lieutenant.
And there's a white version of this too, isn't there?
Yes, a beautiful thing, very, very pure. And that's only, I think, been produced in the last 30 years.
Another plant that has changed quite a bit, really, is the Aquilegia, isn't it? Because I suppose the one that's grown most now is the long-spurred hybrids, or the Macana hybrids. But those old Granny's bonnets aren't grown quite so much, are they?
No, and I think it's a pity. We were lucky enough to have quite a few old ones in the garden, and they've seeded themselves about quite unhelped by me. And I think they're very nice. This is a particularly sort of old and crinkly one. Lovely. The petals are tremendous.
Do you know what that's called?
No, I've no idea what any of them are called. I think they mix and match as they please. But there is one which has become quite well known in the last few years called Nora Barlow, and that's very different, but it's also an old one.
The great Victorian gardener William Robinson summed up the cottage garden philosophy perfectly. Cottage gardeners, he said, are good to their plots and make them fertile. But there's something more, and it's the absence of any pretentious plan that allows the flowers to tell their story to the heart. And it's the story of the flowers that we'll be telling in this programme. After I'd laid out my new cottage gardens at Barnsdale, came the fun of planting them. And believe me, it really is fun. If you haven't done it before, you might feel a bit daunted about planting the garden. And particularly if you've been reading up about combining colours and putting one plant where it'll complement another. But the lovely thing about cottage gardening is that you can forget all of that. First and foremost, you need to think about putting the plants in where they're going to thrive. So you do need to learn a little bit about them so that you can put the sun lovers in the sun and the shade lovers in the shade. You also need to find out how tall they're going to grow so that you can get the tallest at the back and the shortest at the front, or thereabouts. But the lovely thing is that if you've made a mistake, then you simply move them. And we all do make mistakes, believe me, and this is my classic for this year. Now, when I bought this chrysanthemum, it was sold to me as something that was going to grow about this big, but it's come up to something like 4 feet, so I think I was sold the wrong one. So I need to shift it, and the first thing to do is to make sure that it's really well watered. So that's exactly what I did last night, and now it can be dug out. Now normally I would wait a bit. This plant is just about to come into flower, and I should normally wait until it's finished flowering and then cut it back and all would be well. But it's such a gross mistake and it looks so awful that I want to do it now. I still think that it'll be all right. Now what you need to do is to try and get as big a root ball as you possibly can, but in a restricted space like this, that's not at all easy. But that's, I think, not going to be too bad. That's it, and now it can come out. And now I need to find a new home for it. The back of the border here should be ideal, and then it's just a case of putting the plant in at roughly the same depth, replacing the soil that I dug out, working it well round the root ball, and finally giving it another really good puddling in. And my confidence was well rewarded. In 3 weeks it had recovered and was in full flower. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, it's important to revitalise the soil, and I'm using a bit of good garden compost mixed with a sprinkle of organic fertiliser. And then I can plant these much shorter Crocosmia. Crocosmias are Victorian cottage garden flowers, and they're ideal for present-day gardens too. But there are some plants that are even better than those our grandfathers grew. They used to grow lupins, for example, but because they collected their own seed, the strain eventually deteriorated and the plants weren't too good. Well, in the 1930s, a nurseryman called George Russell started selecting and rebreeding the lupins and produced some extremely good plants, the well-known Russell lupins. Well, alas, they eventually started deteriorating too. But now the process has been gone through again, and there are good new varieties available as well. This one is called New Generation Lupins, and they make very superior plants indeed. Cottage garden plants have always been easy to grow and easy to propagate, and there's a very good reason why. The way that cottage garden plants have found their way from garden to garden is by the well-established practice of gardeners giving plants away to their friends, and then they give them to their friends. And believe me, it's still going on. Every time I visited a garden and admired a plant, one's been found for me in a pot, or it's even been dug up from the garden. And if you think that the range of cottage garden plants is limited, you'd be amazed at what some of those gardeners were growing.
That's a good pink cow parsley, isn't it? It's funny, isn't it? When you drive down country lanes, you see a different clone and you think, oh, I must have that. And you either go and gather seed and sow it.
And of course, that's exactly what the old cottage gardeners must have done. But I bet they didn't grow this.
Oh, yes, they did. This plant, I know, has been grown in this area for at least 50-odd years. We've called it Tissenton because it was so, you know, prevalent in that village. It seemed to be a weed everywhere at one time. And I think my grandfather possibly brought it from there. And we've had it in our family well over 50 years.
Absolutely super, isn't it?
It's very late flowering. It doesn't start coming out until May. I think it's very good because it's white, it's clear, it's got good spires on it, and it's definitely a good front of border plant.
In some of the gardens I visited, I did find more modern plants.
I don't think it matters that they're not all old-fashioned, as long as they fit in with the general plan of things and do well.
And Ballerina, of course, is a very reliable flower, isn't it?
Yes, it is, but you can see even this one has problems.
Well, most of the modern varieties are actually being bred now for resistance to disease, but this has got very bad black spot, hasn't it? What do you do about it?
I'm afraid I don't do anything about it. I'm against spraying, and I pick off the worst of the leaves and just let the rose cope, basically.
Do you find that it sort of gradually deteriorates?
It does. It becomes totally defoliated by the end of the season, I'm afraid.
So what do you do?
Well, other things grow up around it and hide it eventually.
Over here you have an anthemis, which is in flower when mine has finished. Now, how have you managed that?
Well, this started flowering 6 weeks or so ago, and I cut back as the flowers die. I cut them off and cut the foliage back as well, and that helps to keep the whole thing fresh and replenishing itself.
Now, your garden's absolutely full of real cottage garden plants, Rose. This valerian, of course, is a great favourite, isn't it?
Yes, it is, yes.
Do you find that it seeds all over the place?
Definitely. Yeah, you've only got to look around. It's absolutely everywhere. I used to pull it up, but then I think, no, it's so lovely. Just leave it. Enjoy it.
They always seem to seed themselves in the right places, don't
I
they?
know,
It's quite
yes, they
funny,
do.
Yeah.
They do.
And you've got another one here. Is that a self-sown?
Yes, it is.
It's Love in a Mist.
Yes.
Another good old cottage favourite.
Yeah, I love it.
And you find too, don't you, with these seed-raised plants, that you get slightly different colours, which
Yes.
is very nice.
Yes.
You've got a quite dark blue one there as well.
Yeah, that's right. And that one's quite pale compared to it.
Do you actually collect the seed from these?
Yes, I do. I just sprinkle them in the borders. I don't sort of sow them into a tray or anything, just sprinkle them along.
Well, just on the top?
Yeah.
And they do all right?
Yes, they do.
When I visited Alex Pankhurst earlier in the season, she was a mine of information about where early cottage gardeners might have got their plants.
And for instance, this spectacular looking thing is a wildflower. It's the double form of our own native sea campion. And somebody must have seen it growing and brought it into gardens, and it's been handed on as cuttings ever since, because it really is quite different from the ordinary wild sort. I grow the ordinary one, and if you compare the difference in the flowers, I mean, you know, this is like a carnation. It's quite stupendous.
Isn't it? But of course, in later cottage gardens, there was much too wide a variety, obviously, to have all come from the wild. So I reckon that many of those originated in the big house.
Yes, I should think they did. I should think some were liberated and others were given as slips and seeds. Then they thrived in cottage gardens, usually because they were left alone. And of course, when the big houses then went over to capability brown type landscapes, the plants were kept safe in cottage gardens.
I can just imagine, actually, the head gardener pocketing a few seed capsules from this plant.
Oh, this, Venus's navelwort. Oh yes, it takes its name actually from the seed, which is a little brown ring, rather like somebody's navel. It's a wildflower that comes from Portugal, and it's been around for about 200 years in this country. And it's very easy just to take the seeds and plant them.
And of course, plants have also always been spread around by means of cuttings too, haven't they?
Oh yes, and this is a cutting that I acquired in the time-honoured fashion by begging a piece off my neighbour. Of course, they're terribly easy to take from slips. You just pull off these little bits like this and plant them. And the great thing is that she's now lost hers, but I shall be able to give it back to her, which is very satisfying.
Hannah Hutchinson, in her wonderful cottage garden on the Isle of Wight, is another gardener happy to let nature do some of her planting for her.
Well, they're a very commoner garden, Forget-Me-Not, Sutton's Royal Blue, and I let them seed themselves every year. And it makes a lovely mass of colour, as you say.
a beautiful old cottage garden plant, isn't it? And at the back of that is that purple plant. Now that's Honesty, isn't it?
Honesty, that's right, Lunaria. It seeds itself, as the forget-me-nots do, and I just let it ramp.
Because that's been grown in cottage gardens for really centuries.
Generations,
isn't it?
yes, yes. And there is a white one, and Carter's used to do a very deep purple one, but I haven't seen it around lately.
Now you've got a border here which is full of self-seeding plants, lots of herbaceous plants and a few shrubs. Is it an expensive thing to do?
No, not really, because I grow the majority of things from seed. I do buy in, if I go to a plant sale or a nursery, I select rather special things. But the ordinary things like the phlox and the lupins and the daisy plants, I grow all from seed.
All the cottage gardeners I visited propagated their own plants. They had many different techniques, and I did find that in small gardens without a greenhouse, the windowsill was invaluable. For some, a green-fingered instinct proved more valuable than knowledge.
One of my favourites is clematis. And if I'd known in the beginning that you're supposed to have mist propagators and all these fancy things, then I'd probably never have started. But as it happened, I'd already succeeded before I found out you needed all this stuff. So I just have a plant pot and a plastic bag, held on with an elastic band, nice cutting inside, and that's it. In a few weeks, rooted.
That bag doesn't touch the leaves at all. How do you inflate it?
Sealed in here. Piece of very expensive equipment, one drinking straw inside the bag. Greenhouse.
That is absolutely brilliant, isn't it? Wonderful.
It
but
works.
You don't have any plastic bags over the geraniums?
No, I don't, because they don't need them. I think they prefer drier conditions. I think they'd be likely to go all soft and rotten if they had a plastic bag over them.
What sort of success rate do you get?
With the clematis, probably around about 70%, which I think is pretty good. The geraniums, probably more, 90%. All I do is take one or two of the main leaves, like that, and put them straight into a pot. And it doesn't seem to demand anything else other than a spray of water, and within a matter of weeks we've got little plantlets coming out of there, and that's quite easy in a cold house.
I'm very keen on propagating slowly in cold frame. Of course, we don't do everything that way, but you have to be patient, but it means you get wonderful rooting systems and very good plants.
You've got a tremendous number of plants here, and looking at the equipment, it looks as though anybody could make it.
Of course, yes. I mean, you could adapt the idea in all sorts of ways. And I started originally with a wooden box with a pane of glass, and at one stage I had 2 frames with old windows out of the cottage.
And what do you actually root them into?
John Innes, number 1, sometimes seed, and a lot of grit, some horticultural silver sand, just a touch of peat, but not very much. The drainage is very important, because if you get a very wet winter, which we've just had, you can have water lying. Of course, if they're sitting in water for a time, they're going to die.
Now, the frames are uncovered at the moment.
Yes.
When do you cover them?
I do the cuttings in September. Early September I start until the middle of October, and we don't put the lids on at all probably until we're into November, just at night time. And then when the weather closes down, by the end of November they're on day and night. We hardly peep at them at all. And then when February comes, if we get nice bright days with the wind, with the air moving nicely, we lift them off altogether in the daytime, but still close them at night and cover them at night with sacks if we get extreme conditions.
And Carol, are these your tools?
Those are my getting out tools. Yes, when things are ready, I do a long line down between the rows, both sides, and then I cut them out like little cubes, really.
And in those simple ways, flowers like these have been propagated and grown for generations. I love those simple old cottage garden flowers, but you know, here and there we can actually do better than the old cottage gardeners. And we'd be silly not to take advantage of those modern developments. Now, roses are a perfect example. The old-fashioned roses had that wonderful cabbagey look, but many of them had the disadvantage that they would only flower once during the season. Well, now, the old-fashioned ones have been carefully crossed with modern perpetual flowering varieties, and the result is a rose with the old-fashioned cabbagey look that flowers right the way through the season. I reckon, Pat, that we can actually make better cottage gardens now than the old original cottagers could, because we've got improved plants, really, haven't we?
Well, that's right, yes. This is one of them. This is Nepeta Six Hills Giant, which is a much better plant than the ordinary old Fascinia, I think it was called. This is much bigger and more colourful and goes on flowering for months.
And there's a shrub here which can be grown as a small tree as well, which can't have been available for more than, I suppose, about 10 years.
No, probably not. In fact, that's only about 6 years old. But I keep it small by constantly cutting it back in order to get the new young growth, which is the pink and cream colouring, and it stops it getting too big for the border as well.
This is an exciting new introduction from America, which I'm sure the old cottage gardeners would have loved. It's a new verbena, and it'll give you purple flowers right the way through the summer. Now, most verbenas, generally speaking, are only hardy in the warmer counties, but this one is said to be bone hardy almost anywhere. It's got to be worth a try. Alex, tell me about this lavender.
Ah, now that is a new form of French lavender. It's only appeared, as far as I know, in the last few years, and it's much bigger and better than the previous sort. I mean, it's much taller, and it has these lovely long ears which carry on blooming for a very long time.
Is it hardy?
Well, it's supposed to be more tender than the ordinary sort, but I've had mine for 4 years now, and I've had no trouble with it at all. I think it's quite a tough customer.
Of course, you do have the right soil for it here,
Oh
don't you?
yes, very dry. Of course, all lavenders like dry soil.
With this variegated Jacob's ladder, there's an interesting twist. This has just been introduced on the market, and yet there are records of it having been grown as early as the 18th century, and then it seemed to completely disappear. It's been recently found again in a nursery in France and reintroduced over here, and jolly nice it is too. It's got flowers very much like the normal Jacob's ladder, but I'd grow it just for that lovely variegated foliage. One group of plants even Victorian gardeners wouldn't have had many of are the tender perennials. But I think they're extremely good cottage garden plants because they fit all the criteria. They have simple flowers, they're easy to grow, and they're easy to propagate. So never be put off growing them in your new cottage garden just because they're tender. Things like the osteospermums, for example, are quite superb and will go on flowering right the way through the summer. Now, some of these are hardy, but a lot depends on where you live. So it's always worthwhile taking cuttings during the late summer, and they really are very easy to root in a bit of coir compost and grow on over the winter on the windowsill. And then you'll have a really good insurance policy just in case you get a hard frost. You can do the marguerites or argyranthemums in exactly the same way, and again they'll go on flowering the whole season long. I certainly wouldn't want to be without the penstemons. Now, quite a few of these are actually hardy, but not all. And a good rule of thumb is that the ones with the bigger leaves are the ones that are likely to be more tender. So again, it's well worthwhile taking cuttings from these anyway. Things like the hardy salvias can be raised from seed. This is Salvia patens, and that comes very easily from seed, so of course you can get hundreds of plants every year from just one. If you've got a nice, dry, sunny spot, you can't do better than the South African diaceas. These will go on flowering right the way through the summer. In fact, young plants of these can actually flower themselves to death. So if you've just planted one, it's a good idea to cut it back about the end of August time to get it established before the winter. Now, one plant that the Victorian gardeners certainly would have had were the dahlias, but they didn't have anything like the range and the colours and the shapes and the sizes we've got today.
So would the great Victorian gardener William Robinson have used these improved plants? His own garden is now the grounds of a private hotel and had been allowed to decline, but it has now been recreated in his spirit.
We have obviously introduced more plants as they've become available because we feel that the garden is not a museum piece to Robinson, but rather it is a moving historical reminder of what he did, and he was very much a plant collector and introduced things as they came.
And of course he influenced people like Gertrude Jekyll, who was a contemporary, quite a lot, didn't he?
They were friends, but I think also perhaps rivals too. I'd like to think that, like most gardeners, that they put their heads together and discussed things, and who actually sort of put pen to paper first or came out with the idea in the first place is a bit of bone of contention. He liked to imitate nature as far as possible, so he liked things to look natural and not contrived, and so he followed the philosophy of imitating what he saw around him.
How did he get his ideas over?
He was a very prolific writer, journalist. He edited 2 magazines, one called The Garden, the other Cottage Gardening. I think he was trying to get across ideas of how people might improve their current way of gardening. They didn't need to put in so much labour. They didn't need to rip out beds twice a year and put in bedding. They could have permanent plantings, and that he was trying to put that idea across.
Cottage Gardening was not just a magazine about the aesthetics of the garden. It contained a mass of practical information about ornamental borders, but also about other subjects dear to the country gardener's heart. Bees, poultry, and of course vegetables. And that's the subject of next week's programme, the cottage economy.